A pastor spat on a priest in Canada. But what happened next became a modern Marian miracle. On a quiet winter afternoon in Windsor, Ontario, parishioners at St. Mary's Parish gathered for the Sunday noon Mass. Snow still clung to their coats. The candles flickered beneath the statue of Our Lady of the Cape, and a soft chorus of prayer filled the sanctuary. But just minutes after the final hymn ended, something unimaginable happened. A man, tall, tense, and visibly shaking, marched down the center aisle with a fury that cut through the silence like a blade. His name was Robert Sanders, a Pentecostal pastor known across his small Ontario community for preaching passionately against Catholicism, against the Eucharist, and especially against the Virgin Mary. For years, Robert had warned his congregation about the dangers of the Catholic faith. For years, he had called statues idols and the rosary a deception. And on this day, he walked into the Mass determined to prove he was right. Witnesses later said the atmosphere shifted the moment he stepped inside. It wasn't just anger they saw. It was a man whose entire belief system was cracking under the weight of something he didn't yet understand. He confronted the priest, Father Andrew Collins, at the foot of the altar. Voices rose, accusations flew, and then, in one shocking moment, Robert leaned forward and spat directly into the priest's face. Gasps swept through the sanctuary. A woman screamed. A man stepped forward as if to restrain him, but Father Andrew didn't move. Instead, he gently wiped his cheek, reached for the holy water beside the statue of Our Lady, and touched Robert's forehead with a compassion that stunned everyone present. And at that exact moment, the impossible happened. Robert's body froze. A warmth, described by witnesses as a light without heat, surrounded him, and beneath the soft gaze of Our Lady of the Cape, several parishioners saw what they later called tears of light, reflecting and falling across Robert's trembling hands. In the church that day, dozens of people witnessed something no one could explain. But to understand why a pastor walked into a Catholic Mass with so much hatred in his heart, and why heaven chose that moment to touch him, we must go back to where his story began, before the miracle, before the confrontation, before the tears of light. Robert Sanders was raised to believe that Catholicism was an enemy of the gospel. He grew up in Sarnia, Ontario, in a Pentecostal family where sermons were fiery, faith was emotional, and suspicion toward the Catholic Church was passed down like an heirloom. His grandfather had left Catholicism decades earlier, and the wound became a warning repeated to every child. Never go back to the old church, never trust the traditions of men. By 16, Robert was already preaching outside Catholic parishes in London and Windsor. He held a Bible in his gloved hands in the freezing wind and warned Mass-goers not to kneel before statues or pray to Mary. Some walked past him quietly, others stared, but Robert always felt justified, a defender of the truth. He married Monica at a young age, studied at a Bible college in Toronto, and soon became pastor of a small congregation near Windsor. To support his growing family, he worked as an electrician during the week, but every Sunday he stood behind the pulpit with the confidence of a man who believed he had all the answers. And week after week, one message echoed through his sermons. The Catholic Church leads people astray. Mary cannot hear you. The Eucharist is only bread. To his congregation, Robert was bold. To himself, he was certain. To the world around him, he was unshakable. But certainty built on fear can crack easily, and the first crack appeared the day he met an elderly Catholic man who carried a worn rosary in his coat pocket. A man whose quiet faith would begin to unravel everything Robert thought he knew. His name was Everett Rodriguez, and he was the beginning of Robert's transformation. The turning point in Robert's life didn't come from a debate, a book, or a theological crisis. It came from a renovation job. In early winter, Robert accepted a contract in Mississauga, installing the electrical system for a 3-story home, undergoing a full remodel. The work was good, the pay steady. Important for a pastor whose small congregation barely covered expenses. And Robert approached it with the same discipline he brought to his sermons. But on his second morning at the site, he met the man who would quietly, unknowingly, begin to change everything. He was standing near the unfinished kitchen island, wearing a gray winter jacket and a knitted toque, unrolling a set of architectural plans with slow, careful movements. His posture carried both age and steadiness, like someone who had lived long enough to understand the weight of silence. "Morning, son," he said with a warm nod. "Name's Everett Rodriguez. My daughter owns the place. Asked me to oversee the structural details." He looked like any ordinary Canadian grandfather. Gentle, soft-spoken, unhurried. But when he reached into his coat for a pencil, something slipped out and swung briefly in the cold light, filtering through the dusty window. A rosary. Its metal crucifix glinted for no more than a second before Everett quietly tucked it back into his pocket. And just like that, the atmosphere inside Robert shifted. A Catholic. Here. In Robert's mind, Catholics weren't just wrong. They were spiritually dangerous. He stiffened immediately. Everett noticed the tension, but instead of reacting defensively, he simply smiled. "You're Christian, aren't you?" he asked. Robert straightened, ready to deliver the speech he had repeated dozens of times. "I'm evangelical," he replied sharply. "Catholics claim to be Christian, but they pray to idols. So no, not the same thing." Everett didn't argue, didn't frown, didn't push. He simply nodded. Thoughtful. "Interesting. Why do you think we worship idols?" The question was gentle, almost too gentle. But it hit Robert like a hammer. In that unfinished room, with wires hanging from the ceiling and sawdust floating in the air, a battle began, not between two men, but inside the heart of one. Over the next week, Everett and Robert worked side by side in the cold, echoing shell of the unfinished house. The older man moved slowly but deliberately, reviewing structural plans, adjusting measurements, and occasionally humming quiet French-Canadian hymns that drifted softly through the empty rooms. Robert tried to avoid conversation. But Everett, with the patience of someone who understood wounded souls, waited for the right moment. One afternoon, as sunlight fought its way through the dusty windows, Everett spoke. "Robert," he said gently, lowering himself onto an overturned paint bucket. "May I tell you a story? It's not about doctrine, just my life." Robert hesitated, then nodded. Everett folded his hands, eyes deep with memory. "In 1985, back in Trois-Rivières, Quebec, my wife Carmela was pregnant with our third child. A routine ultrasound changed everything. The doctors told us the umbilical cord was wrapped tightly around the baby's neck. They recommended termination. They said it would save Carmela's life, that it was the reasonable choice." He paused. "Not for dramatic effect, but because the moment still hurt. I was an architect," he continued softly, "a man of logic. But that night, we knelt in front of a small statue of Our Lady of the Cape my wife had carried since childhood. We didn't worship plaster, Robert. We asked Mary, who stands beside her son in heaven, to pray for our baby." Robert shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't interrupt. The next morning, new scans were done. The cord had completely loosened. Naturally, the doctors said, "Impossible," they said. Everett took out his old wallet, opened it slowly, and handed Robert a worn photograph, a man in a medical coat smiling with his arms crossed. "That boy is now a doctor in Montreal. He delivers babies for a living. Every time I see him, I remember that Our Lady interceded for us before he was even born." The room was silent. The heater hummed softly. Sawdust drifted like snow. Robert wanted to call it coincidence, misdiagnosis, luck, but Everett's eyes, steady, sincere, unshaken after 40 years, made the words crumble before they left his mouth. And in that unfinished Ontario home, something small but undeniable shifted inside Robert for the first time, a question he couldn't silence. What if I've been wrong? That night, Robert drove home through falling snow, the windshield glowing with the soft orange reflections of Toronto's streetlights. Normally, he filled the car with worship music or sermons from well-known evangelical leaders, voices that reinforced everything he believed. But tonight, the silence felt heavier than usual. His wife, Monica, noticed immediately when he walked through the door. "You're quiet," she said, setting down a stack of worksheets their son had brought home. "Has something happened?" Robert forced a smile. "Just tired. Long day." Yet when he turned away, she watched him with worried eyes. This wasn't the voice of a man who was simply exhausted. This was the voice of a man shaken at the roots. Hours later, the house slept. Two children breathing softly behind bedroom doors, the heating vents whispering through the walls. But Robert lay awake on his back, staring at the dark ceiling. He replayed Everett's story again and again. The impossible ultrasound shift, the child now grown into a doctor, the unwavering gratitude of a man who had no reason to embellish anything. Robert had debated Catholics for years. He had memorized their arguments, counter-arguments, and the Bible verses he believed dismantled them. But nothing had prepared him for a miracle with a name, a face, and 40 years of lived gratitude behind it. At 1:40 a.m., he sat up, rubbed his eyes, and whispered into the cold room, "Lord, why does this bother me so much?" No answer came, only the creak of settling wood, but something unfamiliar stirred in his chest. Not fear, not anger, something far more dangerous to a man who believed he already had every answer. Curiosity. The next morning, while packing his tool belt, Robert hesitated before placing his Bible in the side pocket of his work bag. He told himself it was just habit, but deep down he knew. He wasn't bringing it to defend his beliefs today. He was bringing it because he expected questions, and because, for the first time in years, he wasn't entirely certain he had the right answers. The next day at the construction site in Mississauga, the winter sun cut through the rafters like thin blades of gold. The air smelled of plywood and cold concrete. Robert arrived earlier than usual, hoping to drown his thoughts in work. But as he climbed the unfinished staircase to check the junction boxes, he heard Everett's calm voice from below. "Morning, Robert." No debate, no pressure, just gentle warmth. The kind that disarms. Robert nodded stiffly. "Morning." They worked in silence for nearly an hour. Robert tried to focus on voltage readings, grounding lines, and breaker placements, yet his mind kept looping around the same question. What if Everett wasn't wrong? He had always believed Catholics were deceived. Victims of tradition, misinterpretation, emotion. But Everett wasn't confused. He wasn't emotional. He was a retired architect with a lifetime of discipline in precision, measurement, and evidence. At 9:20 a.m., while sorting conduit clamps, Robert finally spoke. "Everett, yesterday, the story about your son, you really believe Mary intervened?" Everett didn't look surprised. He simply looked up with the kindness of someone who had expected the question. "I don't just believe it," he said. "I've lived my entire life differently because of what happened." Robert swallowed hard. But why Mary? Why ask her? Why not pray directly to God? Everett smiled. Not smugly, not triumphantly, but with the tenderness of a man explaining something sacred. "We did pray to God, but Mary is his mother, and Scripture itself shows her interceding for others. At Cana, she wasn't performing a miracle. She was pointing people to Christ." Robert's hands tightened around a metal clamp. He had preached that passage dozens of times. He had never considered it that way. Everett continued softly. "Intercession isn't competition with God. It's participation in his love. Just like when your congregation prays for each other. No?" Something inside Robert flickered. A subtle crack in a wall he had spent years reinforcing. He wasn't ready to admit it yet, but he couldn't deny it either. For the first time, his arguments felt insufficient, and beneath the hum of power tools and winter wind, a quiet truth began to rise. Everett wasn't trying to win an argument. He was trying to reach a heart. It happened on a Friday afternoon. The kind of winter day in Ontario when the cold sinks into the bones and the sky feels too heavy for its own weight. Robert was on the second floor, tightening a junction box, when a sudden shout rose from the driveway below. "Everett's down. Someone call 911. Robert dropped his tools and ran. He found Everett collapsed beside a stack of drywall sheets, One hand clutched against his chest, breath shallow and ragged. Snowflakes were landing on the old man's coat, melting instantly against the heat of his trembling body. A worker knelt beside him, panicked. "Ambulance is on the way." Everett's eyes fluttered open when he saw Robert. In them, pain, but also an unmistakable peace. "Robert," he whispered, voice thin and breaking. "Please, take my rosary." His fingers searched weakly at the pocket of his winter jacket. Robert hesitated. Instinct, doctrine, years of preaching, pushing back. But he reached in and pulled out the simple wooden rosary. Everett's hand closed around Robert's. "Pray with me. Just one Hail Mary." The words struck like lightning. This was the line Robert had drawn his whole life, the boundary he swore he would never cross. But as he looked down at the fragile man who had shown him nothing but patience, kindness, and quiet wisdom, doctrine felt strangely small. What mattered now wasn't theology. It was compassion. Robert knelt beside him in the snow. His heart pounded painfully in his chest as he opened his mouth. At first, nothing came out. Then, almost against his own understanding, the words formed, "Hail Mary, full of grace." Everett's breathing steadied, just slightly. Other workers joined them, forming a circle. Some removed their hats, some knelt. All watched in reverent silence. "The Lord is with thee." Snow fell softly over the scene. A white veil, almost liturgical in its stillness. No thunder, no visions, but something holy passed through that cold winter air. And when the paramedics arrived, they saw an image they wouldn't forget. A Protestant pastor kneeling in the snow, holding a dying man's hand, praying a prayer he had spent years condemning. That evening, after the ambulance pulled away and the construction site emptied, Robert drove home in a daze. Toronto's winter dusk settled over the suburbs like a heavy blue curtain. Houses flickered with warm lights, families gathering for dinner. Yet inside Robert's car, the world felt silent, suspended, unreal. He replayed the scene again and again. Everett's trembling hand, the rosary pressed into his palm, his own voice, unmistakably his, whispering a prayer he had sworn never to speak. When he walked into the house, Monica looked up from the kitchen table. "You're home late," she said gently. "Everything okay?" Robert nodded, but his eyes were distant. During dinner, he barely touched his food. The children chatted about school, snow forts, and weekend cartoons, but their voices felt far away, like echoes from another life. Later that night, long after everyone had gone to bed, Robert sat alone in the living room. The glow from the street lamps spilled through the blinds, casting thin stripes of light across the carpet. He clasped his hands together. Not in triumph, not in certainty, but in surrender to a truth he didn't want to face. He whispered into the quiet, "Lord, why didn't it feel wrong?" He had expected guilt. He had expected spiritual recoil, the sense of crossing into forbidden territory. But instead, kneeling beside Everett in the snow, he had felt something utterly different. Peace, a peace that had not come from himself, a peace that lingered still, like a quiet fire in the center of his chest. He opened his Bible, searching for reassurance, for ammunition, for something to silence the unease. But every page he flipped only deepened the question he feared most. What if they aren't idolaters? What if I misunderstood them? All this time. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows. Inside, Robert felt the first unmistakable tremor of conviction unraveling. Not because of an argument, not because of theology, but because compassion, freely given, had exposed a fracture in his certainty, a fracture he could no longer pretend wasn't there. 2 days after Everett's heart attack, the job site remained unnaturally quiet. Workers spoke in hushed tones. Some asked whether Robert had heard anything new. Others admitted they were still shaken by how peaceful Everett looked when Robert prayed beside him. But what unsettled Robert most wasn't Everett's condition. It was the lingering warmth in his own heart. A warmth he couldn't explain, a warmth that had no place in the strict theology he preached. On Saturday night, unable to sleep, he scrolled through his phone until he found it. St. Anne's Parish, Mississauga, Sunday Mass, 12 p.m. His thumb hovered over the screen. A single tap would shift his world. He whispered to himself, "I'm only observing, nothing more. Just see what they do." Yet even he didn't believe that excuse. The next morning, Robert drove alone through slush-covered streets. He parked half a block from the church to avoid being recognized by anyone from his congregation. The building rose before him in quiet dignity. Red brick, frosted windows, a steeple that pierced the gray winter sky. Families streamed in through the heavy wooden doors, brushing snow from their coats, greeting ushers with warm smiles. Robert stood across the street, unable to move. This was the place he had warned others about. The place he believed housed deception and ritualism. And yet, the people entering didn't look deceived. They looked at peace. After a long breath, he crossed the road. Inside, the sanctuary glowed with soft, golden light. Stained glass windows painted colors across the pews, a statue of the Virgin Mary. Serene, gentle, illuminated by rows of candles, stood near the front, not as an idol, but as a mother watching over her children. Robert felt a sudden jolt in his chest. Not fear, not anger, recognition, a motherly presence, quiet and steady, lingering like warmth in the winter air. He took a seat in the very last pew, shoulders tight, hands folded, eyes darting across the church. When the opening bell rang and the priest began the procession, every instinct in Robert urged him to stand up and walk out. But he didn't, because somewhere deep inside, beneath years of certainty and preaching, he felt something calling him to stay. The Mass unfolded with a rhythm Robert had never experienced before. Solemn yet gentle, ancient yet alive. Every gesture had purpose. Every response echoed through the sanctuary like waves rolling against a quiet shore. Robert watched everything with the intensity of a man expecting to uncover deception, but instead finding something unsettlingly sincere. The liturgy of the word began. A woman in her 60s proclaimed the first reading with a reverence that surprised him. Then came the responsorial psalm, sung softly by a small choir whose harmonies filled the church like warm breath in the winter cold. But it was the gospel that struck him. The priest read from Luke. The Annunciation. The moment the angel appeared to Mary. The moment she said yes. Robert's pulse quickened. Why this passage? Why today? Then came the homily. The priest spoke with a calm voice, explaining Mary not as a goddess, not as an idol, but as the first disciple. The one who carried Christ, followed Christ, and always pointed to Christ. He quoted scripture seamlessly. Genesis, John, Revelation. Weaving them together with an understanding that felt less like argument and more like illumination. Robert clenched the edge of the pew. This shouldn't make sense, he told himself. This shouldn't resonate. And yet, it did. Then the moment he feared most arrived. The consecration. The priest lifted the host and spoke words Robert had preached against for years. This is my body. The sanctuary fell into profound stillness. Every head bowed, every knee bent, every breath seemed to pause. Robert looked around, stunned by the depth of devotion. A teenager bowed his head with trembling hands. A mother whispered a prayer through tears. An elderly man pressed a hand to his heart as if encountering someone he loved deeply. And then Robert saw it. Everett's wife, Carmela, sitting near the front, eyes fixed on the host with an expression of pure, wordless worship. Not superstition, not ritualism, not idolatry, love, real, unmistakable love. And for the first time in his life, Robert felt a piercing thought rise unbidden. What if they're not worshiping bread? What if they're worshiping someone who is truly here? The certainty he had carried for years trembled, because what he saw in their faces was something he had never once seen in his own congregation. Adoration. When the final hymn faded and parishioners began to rise from their knees, Robert remained frozen in the last pew, breathing hard. The incense, the silence, the devotion, it all pressed on him with unbearable weight. He should have left. He knew he should have walked out the moment Mass ended. but something stronger than pride held him in place. The priest, Father André Lavoie, was still at the altar, cleaning the chalice with reverence. Robert couldn't look away. Every movement was deliberate, careful, as if handling something infinitely precious. A surge of anger rose in Robert's chest. Not because of the priest, but because of the war inside his own soul. Before he could stop himself, he stood. His footsteps echoed sharply on the tile as he marched down the center aisle. A few parishioners turned, startled. Carmela gasped softly when she recognized him. Father André looked up, surprised but calm. "Good afternoon," he said gently. "Can I help you, my friend?" Robert's voice came out harsher than he intended. "You're deceiving these people." The sanctuary went still. Father André set down the purificator. "I'm sorry you feel that way. Perhaps we can talk." "No," Robert cut in. "What you just did, elevating that bread, calling it God, that's manipulation. It's idolatry. And you know it." A few parishioners stepped closer, anxious, but the priest lifted one hand to keep them back. His voice remained steady. "We don't worship bread," Father André said softly. "We worship Christ, who becomes present out of love." Robert shook his head violently. "Those are just words. You're fooling them. You're fooling everyone." "And you?" the priest asked quietly. "Did something today speak to your heart in a way you weren't expecting?" The question pierced him like ice. For a moment, Robert's throat tightened. Something inside him begged him to walk away, to breathe, to calm down. But the storm inside had already broken loose. "You are leading people astray," he shouted. "And someone has to say it." Parishioners murmured anxiously. Everett's wife raised a trembling hand to her mouth. A child clutched his mother's coat, and then Robert stepped closer. Too close. His face inches from Father André's. He could feel his own breath shaking with fury, fear, and confusion. "Stop lying to them," Robert whispered. The priest's eyes softened. "I am not lying," he replied. "I am serving." Those simple words, calm, unarmed, sincere, detonated something inside Robert. Before anyone could react, he spat. A sharp gasp rippled through the church. The priest's cheek glistened with the shock of the act. Silence swallowed the sanctuary. Robert froze, horrified by his own impulse, yet unable to take it back. The priest slowly closed his eyes, then opened them again with an expression no one expected. Not anger, not humiliation, compassion. He wiped his cheek with a linen cloth, looked at Robert, and whispered, "I forgive you." And those three words struck Robert harder than any rebuke ever could. For a long, breathless moment, no one in the sanctuary moved. Parishioners stood frozen mid-step. Carmela covered her mouth, tears pooling. Even the candles near the Marian statue flickered as if the air itself held its breath. Robert stood trembling, staring at the priest he had just spat on. Father André did not step back, did not raise his voice, did not demand an apology. He simply looked at Robert the way a father looks at a wounded son. Steady, sorrowful, unafraid. Then he did something no one expected. He raised his hand and placed it gently on Robert's forehead. The moment skin met skin, something unimaginable happened. Robert tried to pull away, but his body wouldn't move. His knees locked, his breath caught, a warmth, soft at first, then overwhelming, surged through him. It wasn't heat like a fire, and yet it burned away something deep inside. Anger, fear, pride, the walls he had spent years building. Gas echoed around the church as the priest's hand glowed faintly. Not with visible light, but with a presence that everyone intuitively felt. Robert's eyes widened. He wasn't seeing the sanctuary anymore. In a single impossible instant, he saw the priest not as a man, but as heaven saw him. A young seminarian kneeling alone in a chapel, offering his life to God. Countless nights beside hospital beds, praying with dying strangers. The moment a bishop laid hands on him at ordination, a stream of grace descending like invisible fire, Robert saw something else. Something that shook him to the core. A mantle, A lineage, a continuity stretching back 2,000 years, from a bishop to another, all the way to the hands of the apostles themselves. The same authority Christ breathed into them flowed now through this quiet Canadian priest into Robert's trembling soul. A sob tore loose from Robert's chest as his knees finally buckled. He collapsed onto the marble floor, hands shaking uncontrollably. I didn't know, he gasped, voice cracking. Father, forgive me, I didn't know. Father Andre knelt with him, keeping his hand on Robert's shoulder. You came seeking truth, he whispered, and truth never despises those who search. Behind them, something astonishing occurred. Tears began to fall from Father Andre's eyes, but these were no ordinary tears. They shimmered, faintly, impossibly. As though reflecting a light no one else could see, a collective gasp rose from the parishioners, because everyone there understood. This was no human moment. This was a visitation of grace. For several seconds after the shimmering tears fell from Father Andre's eyes, the sanctuary remained paralyzed in sacred silence, as if time itself refused to continue. Then, gently, reverently, people began to kneel, one by one, row after row, until nearly the entire church was on the marble floor. Not out of fear, not out of shock, but out of recognition. Something holy had entered the room. Robert stayed collapsed beside the altar rail, trembling. His breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. He tried to speak, but every attempt dissolved into a sob. His palms pressed against the cold marble, yet all he felt was warmth. The same warmth that had flooded through him moments earlier. A woman near the front whispered, "Merci, Seigneur." Another man clutched his rosary, tears streaming down his cheeks. Carmela stepped forward slowly, as if approaching a burning bush. She knelt beside Robert, placing a hand near his shoulder but not daring to touch him. Her voice shook. We saw it. We all saw it. Father Andre wiped his shimmering tears with the hem of his vestment, but several more fell. Luminous, soft, unexplainable. He leaned closer to Robert. Grace is not something you earn, he murmured. It's something God pours out when the heart cracks open. Robert lifted his head. His eyes were red, swollen, desperate. I thought I knew the truth, he whispered. I spent years fighting Catholics, condemning them, thinking I was protecting people from error. His voice broke. But I was blind. I was so blind. Father Andre's expression softened with a fatherly tenderness. Not blind, he said, just unfinished. Behind them, Everett's wife covered her mouth with shaking hands. A young altar server wiped tears from his cheeks. Even visitors who had never met Robert felt a tug in their hearts. Because what they had witnessed was not humiliation, but transformation. A transformation so sudden, so raw, so unmistakably divine, that no one who stood in that sanctuary would ever forget it. Robert forced himself to sit up. His hands were still shaking. What do I do now?" he asked, voice barely audible. Father Andre exhaled slowly, as though answering the question for both of them. "You take the next step," he said, "and you let God lead the rest." Outside, the winter wind howled softly against the stained glass windows. But inside, an even greater storm had calmed, because in one impossible moment, a man who came to expose deception had instead encountered truth himself. If this story moved your heart, if something in Robert's journey echoed inside your own, we invite you to pause for a moment of reflection. Every conversion begins with a crack of light. Every miracle begins with a heart that dares to ask, "Lord, is there more?" Here at Ave Miracles, we believe that modern testimonies like Robert's remind us that heaven is not distant. It is near, present, and still breaking into our world in ways we cannot predict. So we invite you, share your own grace-filled moment. A prayer answered, a sign received, a moment when God or Our Lady touched your life in a way you cannot forget. Your story may be the light someone else desperately needs today. Subscribe to Ave Miracles if you want to continue walking with us through real modern testimonies of faith, healing, and divine intervention happening here in North America. And in the comments below, tell us, Have you ever felt Our Lady guiding you when you least expected it? Your voice, your story, your witness. They matter more than you know. Thank you for watching. May the peace of Christ and the gentle protection of Our Lady remain with you and your family tonight. Ave Maria.